I don't know about your childhood, but I believe it is the case that children love playing games. Is that not right, those of you who are younger? Or even older ones. We still play games, don't we? Just different type of games. Playing games seems to be part of what it is, even to be humans. Probably all of us in this room have played lots of different games, but I would suspect that there is a game that all of us have played sometimes in our lives, and that's the game called hide and seek. You know the general rules. They go something like this. Someone is in, as you might say, and they're the person that stands still, maybe in a corner somewhere. They're sort of supposed to not be watching, and they count. Maybe they count to 20, they count to 50. And everyone else that's playing in that game, you know the rules, they go off and they find their place to hide. And when the time is up, that is, when the number has been counted down, and suddenly you hear this cry. Simple words. Here I come. Ready or not. Or maybe it's just simply, coming, ready or not. And when you hear that, it's only a matter of time till you're found. It's not a very sophisticated game. It's one we've all played. Maybe even not as children. Maybe some of you still like to play it with your children. Everyone knows it. Everyone loves it. Those words, coming, ready or not, if referred to the Lord Jesus, have profound significance. The passage in Mark 13 that we're looking at this morning really could be titled, Coming, Ready or Not, because that's effectively what it teaches. It's a passage that deals with the suddenness and the unexpectedness of the coming of the Lord Jesus. Now, it's been several weeks since we've been in Mark's Gospel, so let me just very briefly remind you that in Mark 13, Jesus is in the process of answering specific questions that were put to him by his disciples. Those questions were, tell us, Lord, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Those questions, remember, were asked because Jesus had just predicted to his disciples that the magnificent temple in Jerusalem that they had just been in and they just were leaving, Jesus said that that temple would be destroyed. His words were, not one stone will be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And the disciples heard that statement and they responded and they were asking, well, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? In their mind, the destruction of the temple and the return of Christ and the end of the age seemed to be a package deal. And therefore the questions came together. So we've worked our ways through Mark 13. We've seen how Jesus initially responds to those questions. In verses 5 through to 13, he gives, remember, numerous directions about how his disciples should live throughout the whole period between his first and his second coming. Jesus says, remember, in that period there'll be wars, and there will be rumors of wars, but he says the end is not yet. There will be earthquakes, there will be famines. He says, these are the beginnings of sorrows. They're not the end. They are the beginnings of sorrow. Jesus also says, in this period between the first and second coming of Christ, the disciples are to preach the gospel to all the nations because God has a chosen people scattered all over the world that he is saving, and he will save them by his people preaching the gospel. And yes, Jesus' disciples, as they seek to live out the gospel and preach the gospel, will suffer persecution. They will be hated by all, but they must persevere to the end. And then in verses 14 to 23, Jesus, it seems, begins to hone in more directly on their questions. Jesus' primary focus in verses 14 to 23 is the destruction of Jerusalem. We know now that that occurred in AD 70. When the disciples, according to verse 14, when the disciples see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, or as Luke says, when they see the troops surrounding Jerusalem, that's when they were to flee to the mountains. That's when they were to escape for their lives. In our last study, we saw in verses 24 to 27, Jesus speaks specifically about his second coming and the end of the age. He says there will be the shaking of the heavens. Verse 25, he says the powers in the heavens will be shaken. He speaks about the coming of the Son. They will see the Son of Man, he says, coming in the clouds and with great power and glory. His coming will be universally visible. Every eye will see him. His coming will be majestically powerful. And then we also saw in that passage in verse 27 that God will send forth his angels. And they'll be sent forth on that last day to gather his elect who are scattered in all parts of heaven and earth. And he will bring them from all places and all times, and he will bring them to himself. We come then this morning to this last section of this chapter, to where Jesus makes specific applications to his disciples with reference to these two great events. That is, the destruction of Jerusalem and his own personal second coming. In verses 28 to 31, it seems to me that he's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. And in verses 32 to 37, he focuses in on the second coming at the end of the age. The two things then that we'll consider this morning by way of how we're going to approach this passage, the two things will be, firstly, an observation with implication. And then in the second part, we'll see a declaration with application. Firstly then, an observation with implication. Look with me again in your Bibles back at Mark chapter 13 from verse 28. We'll just reread these verses. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So, you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the door. Jesus makes this observation. It's an observation that each of those disciples could also make in relation to fig trees. He says in verse 38, learn this parable. It's about fig trees, he says. When its branch has already become tender and it puts forth leaves, you know this. You've observed this. You know that summer is near. Now, do you remember where Jesus is when he speaks these words? Remember where he is? He's on the side of the Mount of Olives. He's there with his disciples. They've come out of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives looks back over the city of Jerusalem. They're perhaps looking back over the temple. There were fig trees that grew in abundance on the Mount of Olives. So we could easily imagine, could we not, that Jesus, as he says this little parable, as he highlights this thing, as he makes this observation, that Jesus could have actually literally been pointing to one of those fig trees nearby where he and the disciples were. We not only know where he was, we know when this was, don't we? We know that this time of year was near Passover because the Passover feast was only a couple of days away at the end of this week. When does Passover fall in? Well, Passover in that part of the world falls in their spring. For us it's autumn, but for them it's spring. And in spring, winter is past. Summer is just around the corner for them, as Jesus actually says that very thing in relation to this fig tree, or these fig trees. So as the temperature during those very days was beginning to increase, winter was behind them, and there's this resurgence of life within the plant world, could we call it. This resurgence of life beginning to become evident even in those very trees around them. The sap in those trees was now beginning to flow afresh. The branches were no longer brittle like they were in winter. The branches were now tender. The fresh leaves were beginning to appear. They could see that with their own eyeballs. And all those things were telling them, summer is near. Jesus made this basic, obvious observation. It was an observation with a clear implication. For he goes on to say in verse 29, so you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the door. Now we're at one of those parts in this passage that's one of the tricky parts. And we've seen some of them in the past. And the tricky thing about this in verse 29 is to what is Jesus referring to when he says, when you see these things happening? What are these things that Jesus is speaking about? Is Jesus referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, which we know occurred in AD 70? Or is he speaking about things relating to his own second coming? Things, remember, that he's just spoken about in verses 24 to 27. And there's the dilemma. Which one is it? Well, I think the next verse helps us. Look at verse 30. Assuredly, or that's the word amen. This is a very solemn thing he's about to say. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all, notice this phrase, all these things take place. These things, whatever these things are, these things will come to pass in that generation, Jesus says, in this generation. Now, some of you may be aware, maybe even being taught, that this generation is not this generation, it's broadly. And some try and take the term generation and they go and seek to find ways that the Greek translation has dealt with the Old Testament scriptures and try and make generation be more broad and general. But the basic reading of the word generation, the basic understanding, the standard use in the New Testament of the word generation refers to people alive at that time, people of that generation, just as we use the word. So when we consider that, but when we also note the few other times this phrase is used in the chapter, I think it's helpful as well. These things that are just being described. Look back in verse 23. He says, but take heed. See, I have told you all things beforehand. I've told you everything, all these things, before they happen. Now, all the things that he's speaking about there, what are they? Well, they're all the things that he's just referred to back all the way up to verse 14. They are things related to the destruction of the temple. And remember, Jesus is answering their question that comes to us. It's recorded in verse 4. And in that very question, these words are, when will these things be? That question, remember, grew out of Jesus' prediction about the massive stones of the temple being thrown down. So Jesus makes this observation. He says, as you can feel the tenderness, the suppleness of the fig tree branches, and you can see with your own eyes these new leaves beginning to sprout, you know that summer is near. So too, when you see the troops surrounding the city, when you see the abomination of desolation occurring, standing where it ought not, then you know that the destruction and devastation of the temple is near. Or as he says there also, it is at the doors. It's at the doors. Strange sort of expression, at the doors. When someone comes to your door at home, they're not in the house, are they? But they're almost in the house. They're right there. They're so close to your house, they can knock on your house. They can knock on your door. They can knock near your door. They can press that button if you have one. They can ring the bell. They're just there. No, they haven't come in yet. But you can't get much closer to being in than being right at the door. They are so near that they can press the bell. The bell is ringing. They're at the door. And Jesus says, I have told you about these things beforehand so that you might know that the destruction of Jerusalem is near, that it's right at the door. The bell will ring for you. When you see those troops surround Jerusalem, the bell should be ringing for you. It should be knocking on your noggin. When you see the abomination of desolation, it is near. You can look at these fig trees, he says, and know what's about to happen. Well, you need to look around you and you need to stay alert. You need to take heed when these things are unfolding, as I have said before they would happen. Know then that it's the time to flee my wrath before you are consumed. I am coming to visit the city in judgment. I am coming in wrath because they have rejected me. You need to be ready. Effectively, Jesus was saying, I'm coming, ready or not. As day follows night, as summer follows winter, know for certain that what I said will surely occur. Look at verse 31. This is the guarantee that it will occur. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. An observation, a common observation for those people. An observation with implication. But now, in the second place, notice a declaration with application. Jesus firstly makes an observation, but now he just makes this declaration. Verse 32. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Let me draw your attention to the obvious. See how the verse starts with that little word, but. Jesus introduces a contrast here to what he has just said. So what he has just spoken about is known, and it can be known. You will see it coming. Like you can see summer coming when you see the new leaves coming on the tree. It can be known, it can be observed. But what he now speaks about is not like that. There's a change here in Jesus' focus. In verses 28 to 31, he spoke about what I think was unfolded in AD 70. But now, from verse 32 and following, he shifts his focus into what is yet future, even for us. His second coming. And we have further reason to think that, not just by the little word but what he goes on to say in verse 32 when he says, but of that day and of that hour. That phrase, that day, is a rich, loaded Old Testament term that speaks of the day of Yahweh's appearing. Elsewhere when Jesus used the term that day, he referred to the last day. Look in your own Bibles to the next chapter, chapter 14. He uses it in verse 25. He says, assuredly I say to you, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 12 he says, I say to you that it will be more tolerable for Sodom in that day than for that city. Sodom, wicked Sodom, will fare better on the final day than the city that rejects my gospel and my gospel workers, he said. That final day. Here Jesus uses that same phrase, that day. Verse 32 of Mark 13, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. You see the contrast? That the temple's destruction could be foreknown in time in order for the people to flee to the mountains. However, the coming of the Son of Man cannot be foreknown by any man. It will come upon you suddenly, he says. It will come upon you unexpectedly. Coming. Ready. Or not. Now verse 32 in many ways is mystifying. Jesus says no one knows which day, no one knows what time of day when the Son of Man will come in the clouds and in great glory. Not even the angels know this. And you think about that. And though the angels stand in a very close relationship to God, though we could say they are ones who are nearest to God, and surely the ones most likely to know, and especially in light of their involvement in the last day. Remember, as we sing that back in verse 27, they'll be sent to every part of the earth and heaven to gather God's elect. For though they are the closest to God, though they're going to be involved in the last day, no, not even the angels know when that day will come. And then Jesus gives this statement that has puzzled theologians and serious-minded Christians ever since. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. Nor the Son? How can Jesus, who is God in the flesh, not know something? Not know something that is so important to his saving purposes? Well, time doesn't allow us to park here, and neither do I fully understand it to explain it anyway. But suffice it to say, in passing, Jesus' words there must be viewed from the aspect of his human nature. Yes, he was God, but he was also truly man. And in his humanity, he experienced the normal human limitations. And I say that with no hesitation, and you actually believe that if you believe what the Bible records about Jesus. And we struggle to put this together because it is a mystery of the deity of God and the humanity of man being together. We can't understand it. It's beyond our comprehension. But the Bible makes some things that are clear for us to grasp at this level. In his humanity, Luke tells us in chapter 2 that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. So though he is the God of wisdom who possesses all wisdom, God takes on human flesh. He takes on those limitations of a human as a child, and as he grew, not just in his height, he grew in wisdom. You know the other references in relation to his humanity. He had those normal human limitations. He was weary. John chapter 4, he had to sit down by that well where he was talking to that woman. He was weary. He was thirsty. He was hungry. He falls asleep in a boat when everyone else can't believe that he's still asleep on that pillow and water splashing all over the place. He experienced normal human limitations. At that point in time when Jesus makes this declaration recorded by Mark in chapter 13, verse 32, the Son in his humiliation did not know the day of his return. Only the Father knows. Now the point being, the time of the coming of the Son of Man is hidden. It's concealed. And I think those words in Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 29 apply wonderfully to this passage. And many of you know that verse. I'll quote it. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of the law. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. But there are other things. Those things which he has revealed, they're ours. That's what he said. They belong to us. They belong to our children forever, that we might not just know them, but that we may do all the words of this law. There are certain things that God in his wisdom has chosen not to reveal to us. But friends, there are other things, loads of other things, that he has revealed, and it's those things that we must pursue. It's those things that we must embrace, and it's those things that we must seek to do. They are the things that belong to us and to our children. Now this declaration in Mark 13:32, where Jesus says that no, not one of us knows when Jesus will come back again, that has application for us, and that's what Jesus goes on to mention in the rest of this passage. There were things that Jesus did reveal about his coming. And there were things that were connected to him coming back again, and the words that he goes on to say, and they are the things that we must embrace. So in other words, we shouldn't get caught up in verse 32 and just puzzle about it all day and get caught up in our theological harebrained ideas and lose sight of what Jesus does reveal. What does he reveal then? Well, in light of the fact that no one knows when the Son of Man is coming back again, he says in verse 33, take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when the time is. In light of our ignorance as to when Jesus is coming, we know that he is coming, but we don't know when. In light of that ignorance, Jesus gives 3 clear, simple commands for us to obey. That's what they are. They are imperatives in the Greek language. Present tense verbs that are in the form of a command. What are they? Everybody can see them. If you can read, you can see it. This is not complicated. Verse 33, he says the first thing, take heed. Now, if you've only been half listening, over recent weeks when we've been going through Mark 13, you would have heard that directive before. This is the 4th time that Jesus says, take heed, in these verses from verse 5 through to here. Take heed, take heed, take heed, and now finally he says, take heed. See to it that you maintain the perspectives, attitudes, and spiritual disposition essential for preparedness for my return. It's a present tense command. Not just once do this. You are to continue to do this, Jesus says. You are to stop speculating about the time of my coming. You are to throw away all your charts and throw away all your speculative novels and concentrate on this duty. Take heed. Take heed. Beware, Jesus says. Now that sort of thing doesn't just fall into your lap one day when you're feeling super spiritual. You have to exert yourself. Preparedness demands diligence. Taking heed requires conscious effort on our part. In light, Jesus says, of the secret thing that belongs to the Lord. No one knows when he comes. In light of that, embrace what has been revealed to you. Take heed. This belongs to us. This belongs to our children. This is what we must do. He's coming. Ready or not? Therefore, take heed. The second command Jesus lays before us is watch. And again, as I said before, it's a present tense command. So constantly he says, stay awake. Now this word in the original is a compound word. 2 words put together. Literally means to chase sleep. To chase sleep. If you're driving your car and you have a long journey in front of you, perhaps you have to drive in the night, or maybe you choose to drive through the night, you're behind the wheel. You have to do this very thing Jesus said. You have to watch, or literally to chase sleep. Chase sleep away from your body. Chase sleep away from your eyes. When your top eyelids want to head downwards, you are to chase them back up. You are to be watchful and stay awake. So perhaps some of you do what I've done before. You chew gum. Or when that's all past its chewiness and its flavour, you get rid of that, you sip coffee. You turn the air conditioning up. Everyone else has to have blankets on, but you've got to stay awake. Or you put the earplugs in and you listen to preaching, that'll keep you awake. There's some of the things I do. We know what it is to stay alert, to chase sleep away. That's what Jesus says. Maintain wakefulness. That's the idea of this word. I'm not even sure that's an English word, but that's the idea of this, wakefulness. In light of the unknown timing of Jesus' coming, we must not drift off to sleep. We must stay alert. We must stay awake. We must chase spiritual drowsiness away because He's coming, ready or not. And then He says, the third thing He says in verse 33 we must do is pray. Constantly praying. Ever looking to the Lord to help us have hearts like that battery. The ever-ready battery. That's at least its promotion. It's ever-ready. That's what our hearts are to be like. Ever-ready. Our hearts are to be always charged like that battery, at least as it claims. Our hearts are to be charged by prayer, that we might be able to take heed, that we might be ever chasing sleep, spiritual drowsiness away. It is by prayer. You see, we cannot maintain a true preparedness for Christ's second coming in our own strength. That's why we must cry to God for help. There is to be a spiritual preparedness, a constant dependency upon the Lord for strength every day. If you have not been praying yourself privately over this last week, you are not ready for His coming if He comes today. In light of the uncertain timing of Jesus' coming, He says, be constantly maintaining a prayerful disposition. In verse 34, He gives us a little relief, as any good preacher does. It's been intense, and then He gives an illustration. That's what Jesus does. Look at verse 34. It's like a man, the story. It's like a man going to a far country, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Try and imagine the scene. The master of the house has to go away for some business somewhere or some vacation. He's going away for an unknown period of time, but he will come back. And as he leaves people with various responsibilities. He places his servant in charge of various duties. Imagine you're there, and you're the one that's mentioned about at the end of verse 34. You're the doorkeeper, or it could be translated the gatekeeper, or if you like the old-fashioned word, you're the porter. And he's got a special directive to you. You must fulfill your duty. He commands you to remain alert at your post. You are to oversee the master's goods. You must watch at your post. And away he goes. And he's gone for weeks and months. And you've been diligent. And you've been working hard. And you've been seeking to be a faithful servant to your master. And you know he will come back. And one night you're at duty. You're at your post. It's 2 a.m. in the morning, and the master comes back unannounced, and he finds you. What's that? He's snoring, exactly. He's asleep. You're asleep. That's what he finds you doing, snoring. And the master comes, and maybe he kicks your feet. He nudges you. You open your eyes, and you look straight into his face. Oh no! I've fallen asleep. How do you feel? What shame comes over your whole being. What embarrassment. You'd sit there speechless. Jesus says, verse 34, watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. There are 4 times in the night that the Romans would use for keeping watch. 4 posts of the night. He says, keep watch. You don't know when he's coming. It could be any of those times. Verse 36, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And then Jesus turns from addressing the 12 disciples who are gathered around him on the side of the Mount of Olives. And in a sense, Jesus turns on that day, that afternoon probably. He turns and he looks, he casts his sovereign gaze over all time. And he looks at every disciple of Christ. He turns to you this morning. He turns to me this morning, if you're a Christian. And he says in verse 37, and what I say to you 12, I say to all, what? I am coming, ready or not. Jesus says, your duty as a Christian, in relation to the second coming of Christ, your duty as a Christian is not to be clever in piecing things together in the end-time puzzle. That's not your duty. Your duty is to be watchful, to keep alert to spiritual realities, to stay committed to present duties, to take heed, to watch and to pray. There's something else implied though, I think, in this story, and that's work. Because the master left you with work to do when he went away. Yes, he has gone away. But in his absence, he has given you a job to do. We must work while it's day, for the night is coming when no one will work. Sadly, some Christians spend too much time thinking about and talking about their ideas of theology, dwelling upon things perhaps where they may differ from others and ticking the boxes and crossing the others. So much so consumed with that they're not involved in the work of God at all. Not in a committed way with God's people. They're not working in the Master's house at all. They back away because maybe they can't agree with everything of those other Christians. But Jesus is coming. Life is short. There will always be differences between Christians. He's coming whether people have heard about him or not. We must work. It is our duty to get his message out. It is our duty not just to talk about what we believe, but to do what we believe. We must watch. We must work. We must remain alert at our post by fulfilling the duties that he has left us to do. We can't afford to become drowsy. I'm coming. Ready or not? Time is running out. He's counting down the number. I'm coming. Are you ready? Or are you not? Though the time of his appearing is unknown, the fact of his appearing is certain. He says, I remind you, going back to verse 31, Jesus' declaration, what he says is always going to unfold. Heaven and earth will pass away. It's going to happen. But my words will by no means pass away. The vast majority of Jews in the first century Palestine day, in that generation, they looked at their temple with great pride. It was their security. They thought they had a good hiding place. Literally, that's the case. Many of them fled there when the Romans come, rather than fleeing to the mountains like they should have. And there, thinking they were going to hide and be safe, they perished. The temple stood as an impressive expression of their stability in that generation. The massive structure that Herod had taken so long to rebuild, and that was still under construction in Jesus' day, and only was concluded just before AD 70. That massive structure must have seemed so stable, so secure for them. Those stones, remember we said this weeks ago, one of those stones was so large it would not fit into this room. Would have seemed immovable. But what Jesus said would happen did happen. Not one stone was left upon another in that temple. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. You look out to the heavens in an evening, you look up at those twinkling lights, those stars in the sky, and you think, well, they were there last night. I've always remembered them being there since I was a kid. They've been there for thousands of years, and they'll be there tonight. It's secure, it's stable. We look at the earth, it's so solid, so firm. We look at the hills, we look at the mountain ranges, we hop in our cars, we head into Rosewood. As we go into town, you can see the mountain range in the background. It's been there for thousands of years, it's so secure. It'll never pass away, we might be thinking. This very word that Jesus used, the exact same word, heaven and earth will pass away. Peter uses that same form of the Greek word in 2 Peter 3. He says, the heavens will pass away with a great noise. And the Apostle John uses the same verb in Revelation 21. He says, the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Heaven and earth, it's a promise. They will pass away. But my words will not by any means pass away. Yes, the heavens and the earth will be changed. But Jesus is saying, my words, they cannot be changed. They cannot be altered. They stand. They are certain. It will happen. The first century generation of those people there in Palestine, they saw the Roman troops march into Jerusalem. The temple stones were thrown down. 1.1 million Jews died in that horrible siege in AD 70. What Jesus said would happen, did happen. And friends, the second coming of Christ will happen just as Jesus said. He will come in the clouds with great glory and great power. His coming will be sudden. The language of the Bible is, it'll be like a thief in the night. Thieves don't normally leave you a note in the letterbox and say, I'll be around at 2 a.m. in the morning. They come unexpectedly. They come when you are not prepared for them. That's how Jesus will come. If you are not converted this morning, if you are not a Christian, these words that Jesus is speaking about here of his own second coming, there's no comfort for you in these words. Because in your present state, these words actually should fill you with fear and dread. Jesus' words are very clear. When he comes again, he will gather all of those who are not saved. He will gather them together. He says in Matthew 25, he will say to them, depart from me into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Those words of Jesus will not pass away. They're tragic words. And they will happen. But Jesus also said other words that will not pass away. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Jesus says that all who come to him, he will by no means throw away, cast out, reject. Heaven and earth will pass away, but those words will not pass away. He's coming, ready or not. And you won't be able to hide from him and his coming. Some of you are not ready. Some of you younger ones. Jesus came back this afternoon. You're not ready. You know you're not ready. You need to get ready. You need to seek God and ask him to save you that you might be ready. Because if you think you're going to have enough time when you see him in the clouds, you're mistaken. It'll be all over in a twinkling of an eye. Go to Jesus. He's the one that can prepare you for his own coming. The Father is counting down the days and the hours. Jesus' closing words in the Bible are these. Surely, Revelation 22, surely, I am coming quickly. Jesus' words are sure and stable. I am coming soon. Coming. Ready or not. I command you, Jesus says. Be ready. In love, I'm telling you, I'm coming. Be ready. Jesus says to us who are believers, watch. He says to his own, be ever watchful. You do not know when I'll come back in. May none of us here this morning be found shamefully asleep at our post. May we watch. May we pray. Friends, may we work. May all of us be ready, though we do not know when the day will come. That day will come. Coming, ready or not. Let's pray.